Vera Holloway pressed her bloodied palm flat against the wooden fence rail and didn't flinch. Inside the corral, the black stallion called Thunder screamed not like an animal, but like something that had been wronged so deeply it had forgotten the difference between rage and grief. 42 men had tried to break him. 42 had failed. And now a woman with a stolen name, a dead woman's ticket and bruises still yellowing beneath her sleeve, was the only one left willing to step inside. This is the story of what happened when she did. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. You will not want to miss a single word of what comes next. The train from Cheyenne arrived 40 minutes late, which gave Vera Holloway 40 extra minutes to sit in the last car and talk herself out of what she was about to do. She didn't succeed. The letter was folded in her left boot, pressed flat against her ankle. She could feel the edge of it with every step she took, a paper reminder of a woman who was dead and a lie that was very much alive. Mabel Hines. That was the name she was carrying into Powder River Valley, Wyoming on the hottest afternoon of the summer of 1882. Mabel Hines, widow of Jackson County, Ohio, age 29, responding to a matrimonial advertisement placed by one Mason Dyer of the Rocking D Ranch. Vera had read the advertisement so many times the ink had begun to blur at the folds. She did not read it again. She already knew every word. I am not a man who wastes paper on sentiment. I own and operate a cattle ranch of 2,000 acres in Powder River Valley, Wyoming territory. I require a capable woman, one who understands that this is a working arrangement, not a fairy story. In return for your loyalty, your competence, and your willingness to remain, I will provide security, fair treatment, and a home that will not be taken from you. If these terms suit you, present yourself at Clearwater Junction Station on the 14th of July. I will meet you there. Mason Dyer. Security. Fair treatment. A home that will not be taken from you. 3 things Vera Pierce, which was her real name. The name Leonard Marsh had poisoned so thoroughly, she couldn't wear it anymore, had not had in 4 years of marriage to a man who smiled at church and locked the pantry when he was displeased. She had not planned to take Mabel's place. She had not planned anything. She had been sitting in the Cheyenne station with $6.40 and no destination, when the woman in the green traveling dress sat down beside her on the bench and said, "Lord, but it's hot." And that had been the beginning of 3 days that changed everything. Mabel Hines had been practical, funny, and dying without knowing it. Heat sickness, the station doctor said, though by the time he arrived, Mabel was past caring what anyone called it. She had pressed the letter into Vera's hand in her last lucid hour and said, "Don't let them burn my things. I hate waste." Vera had not burned her things. She had become them instead. Now the train lurched to a stop, and the conductor called out Clearwater Junction in the bored tone of a man who had announced this stop 1,000 times and expected to announce it 1,000 more, and Vera stood up on legs that felt like creek water and walked toward whatever came next. The platform was small. July heat came off the boards in waves she could feel through the soles of her shoes. 3 people waited, a woman with 2 children and a wagon, a gray-haired man with a post office bag, and someone standing apart from all of them, arms crossed, hat pulled low, watching the train with the expression of a man who had been stood up before and was already deciding how angry he was going to be about it. Vera knew immediately. The way he stood like a fence post that had grown roots told her everything. She picked up her canvas bag and walked toward him. He didn't move to meet her, didn't tip his hat. His eyes, when she got close enough to see them, were a shade of gray that reminded her of sky before a thunderstorm, not threatening exactly, but charged with something waiting to break. "Mr. Dyer," she said. "Miss Hines." His voice was low and flat, the kind that carried without effort. He looked her over the way a man assesses a horse at auction, not rudely, just honestly checking for something she couldn't name. "That all you brought?" "Yes, sir." "You strong enough to carry it yourself?" The question surprised her. Not "can I take that for you," but a flat inquiry about her own capability. She almost smiled. I carried it from Ohio. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, more like the absence of dismissal. Wagons this way. He turned and walked without waiting to see if she followed, and Vera followed, because that was the deal she had made with herself in the last car of the Cheyenne train, that she would stop running and start building, even if building meant walking behind a stranger in a July heat that made the air taste like copper and dust. The wagon was hitched outside the general store. 2 bays solid and patient. Mason climbed to the driver's seat without offering her a hand up, and Vera climbed up herself, settling her bag between her feet, folding her hands in her lap the way she had learned to fold them when she needed to look calmer than she was. "Hour-and-a-half ride," Mason said, taking up the reins. "Road's rough past the junction marker. You get motion sick." "No. You know anything about cattle ranching?" "I know what I've read." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had more warmth in it. "Reading about it and doing it are not the same thing." "I know that too. I learn quickly." He glanced at her sideways just once. "We'll see." They rode in silence for a while. The Wyoming grassland stretched out on both sides, golden brown, enormous, broken by stands of cottonwood along creek lines and the dark shapes of cattle grazing on distant slopes. The sky above was the hard, bright blue of deep summer, not a cloud anywhere, the sun direct and merciless. Vera could feel the back of her neck burning. "Your letter said you manage household accounts," Mason said eventually. "Yes, and I'm comfortable with ledgers, invoices, payroll records." Previous employment. She had prepared for this. "I managed a household in Jackson County for several years. Before that, I worked in my father's practice." "What kind of practice?" "Veterinary." That got a real reaction. He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and she saw something that wasn't quite surprise, more like recalibration. "Your father was a vet?" "Yes, sir. I grew up working alongside him." "Cattle, horses?" "Both, and everything else that needed help." Mason turned back to the road and was quiet for a full mile. Then, "I have a horse situation." "I heard something about that in the station," Vera said carefully. "A woman waiting for the eastbound train said something about a wild stallion." "What did she say?" "That 40-some cowboys had tried to ride him. That he'd sent most of them to the doctor in Clearwater." Mason's jaw tightened. 42. "What happened to the 43rd? "Haven't tried a 43rd yet." Vera looked out at the grassland and said nothing, but she filed that information away, in the careful place where she kept things that mattered. The rocking D ranch appeared around a long curve in the road. First, the windmill, then the roofline of the main house, then the sprawl of it, opening up the main barn. 3 outbuildings, corral after corral, spreading out like spokes from a wheel, and beyond them separated from everything else by a stretch of empty ground and a fence that looked newer and heavier than anything else on the property. A single dark corral that sat alone like a period at the end of a sentence. Even before she saw him, she heard him. The sound came across the July heat like something breaking high, wild, furious. And underneath the fury, something that made Vera's chest tighten in a way she didn't expect. It wasn't a horse sound. It was the sound of a creature that had been through something it couldn't name and had decided that rage was the only language left. She knew that language. She had spoken it herself in silence for 4 years. "Thunder," Mason said. And the single word carried more weight than anything else he'd said on the entire ride. "That's his name. He came with it. Horse trader from Denver named Silas Grove sold him to me 8 months ago. Said he was green broke, just needed time and a firm hand." His mouth flattened. "Grove lied." "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing wrong with him." The answer came out sharper than the rest, and Mason seemed to hear it because he softened the next word slightly. "He's not crazy. He doesn't trust. Not anyone. Not anything. Every man on this ranch has tried. My foreman spent 6 months on him. And Thunder put him through the fence twice." The wagon pulled into the main yard. Ranch hands looked up from their work mending fence line, hauling water from the well, carrying tack from the barn to the paddock. Every one of them stopped to look at Vera. She felt the weight of it, but kept her chin level and her eyes steady. A man came out of the barn. Tall, lean somewhere in his mid-40s with sandy hair going gray at the temples, and an easy open smile that reached his eyes in a way that felt practiced rather than felt. He walked toward the wagon with the comfortable authority of someone who knew exactly where he stood in the order of things. "So this is her," he said. His voice friendly, genuinely friendly, the kind that made you want to like the person immediately. "Miss Hines, I'm Carl Whitten. I run the day-to-day operation here. Welcome to the Rocking D." He offered her his hand to help her down, and his grip was firm and warm, and he said, "You have a long trip," and waited for her answer with what looked like real interest. Vera said, "Long enough." And Carl Whitten smiled like she'd said something clever, and turned to Mason and said, "Storm's building up over the Bighorns. Might push south tonight. I've got the hands moving the southern herd to the lower pasture just in case." "Good call," Mason said. "Also," Carl said, his voice dropping just slightly, not low enough to be conspiratorial, just low enough to suggest this was a separate conversation. "Thunder got into the fence again this morning. Northeast Rail 3rd Post. I can have Henry patch it tomorrow, but you ought to know." "How bad?" "Bad enough. He's getting stronger, Mason. 6 months ago, he couldn't have done that to a post that size." Carl glanced toward the isolated corral without quite looking at it. "I'm not trying to have the same conversation again. I just think you should—" "I know what you think, Carl." A beat. Carl nodded easy and unchallenged and turned back to Vera with that open smile. "I'll let Mrs. Langen know you've arrived. She'll want to meet you before supper." He walked back toward the barn, and Mason said without looking at her, "Carl's been with me 11 years. Best foreman in the valley. If he tells you something needs doing, it needs doing." "Understood." "He's also not always right about everything." Vera glanced at him. His face gave nothing away. She stored that too. Dorothy Langen was exactly what the kitchen smelled like, something warm and sharp and no nonsense. She was 60 years old, if she was a day, with iron gray hair pinned back severely, and hands that looked like they had been doing real work since before Vera was born. She looked at Vera the way a woman looks at another woman when she's deciding something important about her, and then she said, "You're not what I pictured." "What did you picture?" "Softer. Sit down. I'll pour you something cold." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Vera in weeks, and she almost lost her composure over a glass of well water and a woman's matter-of-fact generosity. "I'm Dot," the woman said, settling across the table from her. "I've been cooking for this outfit 9 years. I'll tell you right now what everyone else will take 3 months to tell you. Mason Dyer is a fair man and a hard one, and he's been lonelier than he'll ever admit since his wife died, and this ranch runs on his stubbornness more than anything else. Carl Whitten knows this place better than his own name, and he's good at his job, and the reason those two pieces of information sometimes create friction is something you'll understand soon enough." She poured herself a glass. "The horse terrifies everyone, and Mason won't give him up, and that's really all you need to know to understand this whole situation." "Tell me about the horse," Vera said. Dot studied her. "Why?" "Because the way a man treats a broken animal tells you everything about him." A long pause. Then Dot said, "I like you. I didn't expect to." She set down her glass. "Thunder came off a trader's wagon in November. Big black stallion, 17 hands, built like something you'd see in a painting. Grove the trader, he had papers on him, training records, the whole business. Said the horse was difficult, but manageable with the right approach. Mason paid top dollar." She shook her head. "First week he put 2 hands in the doctor's office. Second week, Carl went in to try himself. Carl's a genuinely gifted horseman, no question, and Thunder caught him with a shoulder and cracked 2 of his ribs. By spring, Mason was offering $20 to any man who could stay on him for 5 minutes. Anyone try 42 of them. and none of them lasted 5 minutes. The record is 41 seconds. Young man from the Cheyenne rodeo circuit. Thunder threw him into the fence rail, and he was unconscious before he hit the ground. Dot picked up a towel and began folding it with methodical precision. What Carl sees is a liability. What Mason sees is, I don't know exactly what Mason sees, something he's not ready to give up on. "What do you see?" Vera asked. Dot was quiet for a moment. "I see an animal that's been taught that people coming toward him means something bad is about to happen. And I see 42 men who went in trying to prove that he was wrong about that, and only succeeded in proving he was right." She set down the folded towel. "Now, do you know how to make biscuits, or do I need to teach you that too?" Supper that evening was loud and warm, and completely unlike anything Vera had experienced in 4 years of sitting at a formal dining table while Leonard watched her eat and found ways to make it feel like being assessed. The ranch hands ate at 2 long tables in the bunkhouse dining hall. There were 16 of them this time of year, ranging from Henry Bowman, who was 20 years old and had a sunburned face and the kind of earnest, wide-open expression that made you want to protect him from everything, to an old wrangler named Colt, who had been in Wyoming since before it was a territory and said almost nothing and seemed to miss nothing at all. Vera helped Dot carry platters from the kitchen. She moved between the tables, efficiently refilling coffee, keeping her expression neutral and her ears open. The talk was mostly about work, a fence line that needed reinforcing along the eastern boundary, a heifer that had gone off her feed the weather building over the mountains, and whether it would push south tonight or break north toward Montana. Normal talk. Working talk. The kind she had almost forgotten existed, because Leonard's house had been so quiet, so carefully controlled, that even the sound of ordinary people speaking to each other about ordinary things felt like something close to grace. Henry Bowman said, "Ma'am, you want me to take that?" when she was struggling with a heavy pot of beans, and she said, "I've got it, thank you." And he grinned like she'd done something impressive by managing a pot of beans, which told her everything about where he'd set his expectations. She kept moving. Carl Whitten ate at the near end of the first table, talking easily with the men around him. She noticed how they deferred to him not out of fear, but out of something closer to genuine regard. He had a story about a bull getting loose in Clearwater last spring that had the whole table laughing, and the laughter was real, and he laughed at himself too, which was the mark of a man who felt secure enough not to need the last word. When he caught Vera's eye across the table, he gave her a small collegial nod that said, "You're doing fine," and she wasn't sure yet what to do with that, so she simply nodded back. Mason ate at the far end of the second table, alone in the middle of a crowd of his own men, the way some people can be completely alone, regardless of how many people surround them. He ate without tasting and listened without seeming to hear. And when he was done, he pushed back from the table and was gone without a word, as if he'd only been present in the loosest sense all along. After cleanup, when the last plate was washed and the kitchen was dark and the bunkhouse had settled into the low noise of men winding down for the night, Vera walked out into the yard alone. The July night was warm, which surprised her. She had grown up believing Wyoming nights were cold, but the summer heat had soaked into the ground and was radiating back upward, and the air smelled like dry grass and cattle and something else, something wilder that she couldn't name. Above her, the sky was enormous. Stars from edge to edge, so many and so bright that the sky looked thick with them, like something you could reach up and disturb. She stood there for a moment just breathing. Then she heard him. Thunder's call came from the isolated corral on the far side of the yard, lower than it had been earlier, less frantic, but carrying across the warm, dark air with a quality that made her stop walking and turn toward it without deciding to. It wasn't a scream this time. It was closer to a sound a person makes when they've been crying so long they've gotten quiet, when the grief has moved past the loud part and settled into something that doesn't have a name. She walked toward it. She knew she'd been told not to. Not in those words nobody had explicitly said, "Miss Hines, stay away from the Stallion." But the way everyone had talked around him all evening, the careful geography of the ranch that kept him separated and contained, said it clearly enough. She knew she was walking toward something she hadn't been invited near. She walked anyway. The corral was heavy-railed, the posts twice the thickness of the others, and the fence line had clearly been repaired more than once. She could see the new lumber in the northeast corner that Carl had mentioned, pale yellow against the weathered gray of the older posts. Inside in the dark, she could see the shape of him. Large, dark, absolutely still in a way that felt like the stillness before something shifts. She stopped 6 feet from the fence, just stopped. Didn't call to him or reach toward him, just stood there in the warm July night and let herself be seen. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Thunder moved. A single step toward her, head-high ears pitched so far forward they nearly touched. His nostrils flared, reading the air. She could see the whites of his eyes in the darkness, not rolling with panic, just open alert working. "I'm not going to do anything," Vera said very quietly. "I'm just here." Thunder's ears flicked back, then forward again. "I know what it's like," she said in the same quiet voice, the one she'd learned to use with her father's more frightened patience, the injured animals that had been hurt enough to stop distinguishing between people who helped and people who harmed. "I know what it's like when you've been hurt so many times you can't tell the difference anymore between someone coming to fix things and someone coming to break more. I know how that feels." She wasn't talking just to the horse, and she knew it, but that was all right. There was no one else in the yard to hear. Thunder stood at the far edge of the corral and watched her. Then slowly, he lowered his head. Not all the way. Not submission, not softness. Just fractionally, just enough to change the line of his neck from a weapon to something closer to a question. "That's all right," Vera said. "We don't have to do anything tonight. I'll just stand here a while." She stood there for 20 minutes. Thunder watched. Occasionally he shifted his weight or turned his head to test the air again, but he didn't move away, and he didn't scream, and he didn't charge the fence. He just watched her the way she watched him, carefully cataloging, trying to work out what the other one was. When she finally turned to walk back to the house, she heard him move to the fence behind her. She didn't look back. She'd learned working with her father that sometimes the most important thing you could do was leave before you wore out the welcome. She had her hand on the porch door when Mason's voice came out of the dark beside her. "How long were you over there?" She turned. He was sitting on the far end of the porch in the shadows, a coffee cup in his hand. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She hadn't heard him. "Not long," she said. "Maybe 20 minutes. A pause. "Did he charge the fence?" "No." Another pause longer. "He charges the fence for everyone." Vera said nothing. The night made small sounds around them. Crickets, the distant low of cattle, the dry whisper of grass moving in a July breeze. "He looked at me," she said finally. "That's all." He just looked. Mason was quiet for so long she thought the conversation was over. She put her hand back on the door. "My foreman thinks I should have him destroyed," Mason said. His voice was flat when he said it, like he'd said it so many times in his own head that the words had worn smooth. "He's not wrong about the danger. He's just not right about the solution." Vera turned back. In the dark, she could barely see Mason's face under the brim of his hat, just the line of his jaw and the shape of his shoulders. "What do you think the solution is?" she asked. The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I don't know yet, but I don't give up on things just because they're difficult." She studied him in the July dark. This closed, solitary, difficult man, who refused to stop trying with a horse that had hurt everyone who touched him, who had placed a matrimonial advertisement in the most unromantic terms possible, and called it honesty, who sat alone on his own porch in the dark, drinking cold coffee because some part of him, some very stubborn and very private part, was still watching. "Neither do I," she said, and went inside. She lay awake in the small plain room they'd given her, a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the July stars, and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the bunkhouse walls cooling. the distant movement of cattle. And from the far corral, very quietly, the sound of Thunder pacing the fence line in the warm Wyoming night, back and forth, like a creature still trying to work out whether anything was going to be different this time. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the bed and stared at the ceiling. She was living under a dead woman's name, in a dead woman's arrangement, building something she had no right to on a foundation of borrowed identity and genuine desperation. Everything she touched here, the letter in her boot, the name she answered to, the future, she could almost see the shape of all of it, was built on a lie. But the horse had looked at her. After 42 men, after 6 months of fury and locked fences and broken ribs, and the long Wyoming winter of not trusting anything, he had stood at the far edge of his corral in the July dark and lowered his head and looked at her. That wasn't nothing. That was in fact everything she needed to keep going. She closed her eyes and let the summer night move around her, and decided she would figure out the rest, as it came the way she had figured out everything else in the last 3 years. One stubborn day at a time, with her teeth set and her eyes open, moving toward something she couldn't quite name but could feel was worth the cost. Outside, thunder called once into the dark. Not a scream, not fury. Just a sound. Just a voice saying, "I am here," to the enormous Wyoming sky. Vera listened to it until she finally slept. She was at Thunder's corral before sunrise. Not because she had planned it, not because she had made some grand decision in the night about what she was going to do and how she was going to do it, but because she woke at 4:30 with the summer heat already pressing through the window and the sound of him moving in the far corral carrying across the still air, and her body simply stood up and got dressed before her mind had finished arguing about it. The yard was empty. The sky was the deep blue-black of just before dawn, the stars beginning to lose their edge, the eastern horizon showing the first suggestion of something lighter without yet committing to it. Her boots made no sound on the dry ground. The July air was warm already, the kind of warm that meant the day was going to be brutal and unrelenting, the kind of Wyoming summer day that made you understand why people sometimes just left. She stopped at the same place she'd stood the night before. 6 feet from the fence. No closer. Thunder was at the far end of the corral, head up, watching her with an alertness that told her he hadn't slept either, or if he had, the sound of her approach had brought him fully present in an instant. His dark coat was almost invisible in the pre-dawn dimness. She could see his shape more than his details, the arch of his neck, the high-carried tail, the way his ears tracked toward her with an intensity that was neither welcome nor rejection. Just attention. Just the careful evaluating attention of a creature trying to decide something. "Good morning," Vera said quietly. Thunder's ears moved. That was all. She sat down on the ground, same as she would have done with any frightened animal in her father's practice, made herself smaller, less threatening. Removed the vertical line of herself that read as predator. In the old language, every prey animal still carried in its blood, regardless of how many generations of domestication sat between them and the open plains. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and just sat there in the warming July dark and breathed. After a while, Thunder took 2 steps toward her and stopped. She didn't react, didn't lean forward or make a sound or shift her weight, just breathed. He took 1 more step. Then he lowered his head slightly, his nostrils working, and stood there at the center of the corral in the gathering dawn and looked at her with those dark, enormous, damaged eyes. And Vera looked back, and neither of them moved for a long time. When the breakfast bell rang from the bunkhouse kitchen and broke the silence like a stone through glass, Thunder threw his head up and spun away to the far fence in one explosive motion, and Vera stood up, slowly, brushed the Wyoming dust from her skirt, and walked toward the sound of Dot clanging the iron triangle with the cheerful aggression of a woman who believed in breakfast as a moral position. "You were out there already," Dot said when Vera pushed through the kitchen door. It wasn't a question. "Just getting familiar with the place." Dot handed her an apron without further comment, which was the closest thing to approval Vera had yet received from her, and that was enough. The morning routine established itself with the natural efficiency of necessity. Vera managed the household accounts after breakfast. Mason had left a desk in the front room, buried under 8 months of invoices, supply receipts, payroll tallies, and what appeared to be a complete record of veterinary expenses, organized by no discernible system whatsoever. She pulled it apart and began rebuilding it, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who finds order genuinely pleasurable and had been denied it for a long time. Carl came in around mid-morning and stopped in the doorway when he saw what she was doing. "Mason said you'd be taking that over." It needed some reorganizing. He came closer, looked at the stacks she'd created with the focused appraisal of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. "You've separated the veterinary costs from the equipment maintenance." They were mixed together, different budget categories. Mason doesn't really think in budget categories. "I know. That's why he's 3 months behind on his supplier payments and doesn't realize it." Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's going to need to know that. I'll tell him at supper. He doesn't love being told things." "I imagine not." Vera looked up from the papers. "But he hired someone to manage this so he wouldn't have to, and I intend to manage it." Carl looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something between respect and reassessment. And then he said, "Fair enough," and left, and she went back to work. She told Mason at supper straightforwardly and without softening it. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his fork moving at its same methodical pace. When she finished, he said, "How far behind?" 3 months on Taggart's feed and supply. 6 weeks on the blacksmith account. The lumber invoice from March hasn't been touched. "What's the shortfall?" she told him. He nodded once, the way a man nods when the number is worse than he expected, but not worse than he can absorb. "Fix it. I'll need authorization to write the drafts." "You have it." That was all. He went back to his supper, and Vera went back to hers, and across the table. Henry Bowman looked at her with wide eyes, like she had just done something extraordinary, which she found both touching and a little sad that a woman doing her job competently registered as extraordinary at all. After supper, she went back to Thunder. This time, she brought an apple. Not to offer it, she wasn't ready to offer it, and more importantly, he wasn't ready to receive it, but to have it. To let the smell of it travel across the distance between them and mean something that hadn't happened yet, a promise that hadn't been made out loud. She sat in her place, and the apple sat in her lap, and Thunder stood at the center of the corral and watched both of them with the focused suspicion of a creature that had learned to be interested in things before deciding they were safe. "I know someone else has tried this," she said quietly. "I know you've had people come here with apples and sugar and soft voices, and all of it turned into something that hurt. I'm not pretending that didn't happen." She rested her chin on her knees. "I'm just telling you, I know it happened, and I'm going to sit here anyway." Thunder's left ear swiveled back, then forward. "That's something we have in common," she said. "Sitting somewhere anyway." That became the shape of her days. Mornings at the corral, before the ranch woke up, then accounts and household management through the heat of midday, then supper with the hands, then back to the corral in the evening when the July sun had dropped below the bighorns and the air had cooled to something bearable. She didn't try to rush it. She didn't measure progress in the way that invited disappointment. She just showed up consistently, the way you show up for anything that matters, without fanfare, without an audience, without any guarantee that it's going to work. On the 4th day, Thunder walked all the way to the fence. He stood there 6 feet from her and looked at her from close range for the first time, and she could see now what the distance had hidden the scars. Old ones, long healed, running across his chest in lines too regular to be anything other than deliberate. Rope burns on both front legs worn into the hide and grown over with coarser hair. A pale mark along his left shoulder where something had struck him hard enough to leave a permanent record. Vera's hands tightened in her lap. She kept her voice steady. "I see you," she said. I see all of it." Thunder lowered his head until his muzzle was a foot from her shoulder, and stood there breathing against her hair, warm and slow and careful, as if he too was trying to hold something steady. Carl found her there on the 5th morning. He came around the side of the barn, carrying fence wire, stopped when he saw her sitting in the dirt outside Thunder's corral, and stood for a moment without speaking. Then he set down the wire and walked over and crouched beside her in the dust, the way a man does when he's decided to talk honestly. "He let you that close." Carl's voice was different than it was in the house or at supper. Quieter, missing the easy, practiced warmth. "He came to me," Vera said. "I didn't push it." Carl looked at the stallion who was standing at the center of the corral, watching both of them with wary attention. "I spent 6 months trying to reach him," Carl said. "Slow work, patient work. Everything I knew." He touched his side without seeming to realize he was doing it. "Second time he put me through the fence, I heard something crack, and I just lay there in the dirt thinking, that's what it sounds like when you've been wrong about something." "You weren't wrong about the approach," Vera said. "You were wrong about the starting point." He looked at her. "He wasn't ready for patience yet," she said. "He was still in the place before patience. The place where you can't tell the difference between someone reaching toward you to help and someone reaching toward you to hurt. Nothing works in that place. Not patience, not kindness, not time. The only thing that works is—" She paused. "Presence. Just being there without wanting anything. Until he could decide on his own that you weren't a threat." Carl was quiet for a moment. "And you know how to do that." "I've had practice." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the account books, with that focused, recalibrating attention. "Where'd you learn horses?" "My father." "And the rest of it?" He didn't specify what he meant by the rest of it, but she understood. "Experience," she said, which was true in every way that mattered, and false in the specific ways she couldn't afford. Carl nodded slowly. He stood up, picked up his fence wire, and said, "Mason's not going to make it easy for you, you know. Getting close to that horse. He'll say it's about safety." "Is he wrong about the safety?" "No. Thunder's dangerous. He could kill you tomorrow, even if he's standing calm today." Carl's voice wasn't threatening when he said it, just honest. "But Mason's also—" He stopped, seemed to choose the next words carefully. "He doesn't let people help him easily. With anything, including the horse. If he sees you making progress where he hasn't, it's going to cost you something before it helps you." Vera absorbed that. "Thank you for telling me." Carl touched the brim of his hat and walked away, and Vera sat in the July morning dust and thought about what he'd said, all of it, and particularly the parts she wasn't sure yet how to read. On the 7th day, she put the apple on the ground between them. She set it down and scooted back 3 feet and waited. Thunder eyed it for a long time, his nostrils pulling in the smell, his whole posture taut with the war between wariness and want. Then he stretched his neck out to its full length, his body still planted at a distance. His instincts had decided was safe, and his lips found the apple, and he took it with a delicacy so deliberate it looked almost gentle. Vera's eyes burned. She did not look away. She let herself feel the full weight of it, this small, enormous thing, and she didn't apologize for how much it meant to her, because she had spent 4 years in a house where her feelings were inconveniences to be managed, and she was done apologizing for having them. "Good," she said, just that, just the word. And Thunder crunched the apple and looked at her with something different in his face, something that had not been there 8 days ago. She was still sitting there when she heard the hoofbeats coming up the ranch road, and something in their rhythm, too fast, too purposeful for the end of a working day, made her get to her feet before she consciously decided to. The rider was a man she didn't recognize. Well dressed for the road, his horse a quality animal, his bearing the particular kind of easy that came from being accustomed to things going the way he intended. He pulled up in the main yard and swung down, and Mason came out of the barn with Carl right behind him, and even from where she stood, Vera could see Mason's posture change the moment he recognized the rider, a stiffening through the shoulders. A stillness in the jaw that she'd learned meant he was containing something rather than expressing it. She walked toward the yard, not hurrying, arriving at the edge of it, just as the stranger was shaking Mason's hand with the practiced warmth of a man who used warmth the way other men used tools. "Dyer," the man said. "Good to see you looking well." "Grove," Mason said, and the single word carried the weight of everything he wasn't saying. Silas Grove. She knew the name from Dot's kitchen, from the careful way people had talked around it, from the shape of the scars on Thunder's chest that she had spent 7 mornings sitting with and trying to understand. She looked at him. This man in his clean road coat with his pleasant expression and his quality horse, and she felt something cold and certain move through her. Grove's eyes found her across the yard, with the efficiency of a man who catalogs everything and decides the value later. "And who is this?" "My housekeeper," Mason said, which was not quite accurate, and clearly the first deflection that had come to hand. "Lovely." Grove smiled at her with professional warmth. "I hope you're finding the rocking D comfortable, ma'am." Vera said, "Very," and didn't smile back, and Grove's eyes registered that briefly before moving on. "I'll get to it," Grove said, turning back to Mason. "I've been hearing things, Mason, about Thunder, about the challenges you've been having." The pause before challenges was almost imperceptible. Almost. "I want you to know I feel genuine responsibility for that. I may have oversold his readiness when I moved him to you. I've thought about it a great deal." "Have you?" Mason said. "I'd like to make it right." Grove reached into his coat and produced a folded document with the ease of someone who had prepared this gesture in advance and wanted it to look spontaneous. "I'm prepared to buy him back. Full purchase price plus 15% for your trouble. Clean transaction, no hard feelings." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere behind her, Vera heard Thunder move in his corral. "No," Mason said. Grove's expression didn't change, which told her it had been designed not to change. "Mason, I understand the pride involved, but that animal has hurt your men, damaged your property, and frankly, he's beyond what most trainers could." I said no. "The offer's generous." "I heard you." Mason looked at Grove with those storm-gray eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in. "Answer's still no. You made a sale. The horse is mine." Grove folded the document back into his coat with the careful deliberateness of a man recalibrating rather than retreating. "Well, I respect that." He looked around the yard, once a slow sweep that landed for just a moment on Thunder's isolated corral. "I hope you won't regret it." He remounted with practiced ease, touched his hat brim at Vera, and rode back down the ranch road at the same purposeful pace he'd arrived with. The yard was silent until the sound of his hooves faded. Carl said carefully, "He's never come out here in person before." "No," Mason said. "He could have sent a letter." "He could have." Carl looked at the road where Grove had gone. "What do you think he actually wanted?" Mason's jaw worked. He looked at Thunder's corral for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that he was not going to speak aloud. And then he said, "Get the eastern fence line finished before dark," and walked back into the barn. Carl stood where he was for a moment, and Vera stood beside him, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, because some things are more dangerous when spoken out loud. That night, after the yard had gone dark, and the bunkhouse had quieted, and the only sounds were the July insects, and the distant cattle, and the low movement of a summer wind coming down off the bighorns, Vera went back to Thunder's corral one more time. She didn't sit down. She stood at the fence with her hands at her sides and looked at the scars on his chest, and thought about Silas Grove's pleasant expression and his prepared document, and the particular quality of his eyes when they had rested on this corral, assessing, calculating the way a man looks at something he still considers his, regardless of what any bill of sale says. Thunder came to the fence. He stood there 6 inches from the rails with his dark head level and his breathing slow, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the July night sat warm around them both. "I don't know what he's planning," she said quietly. "But I know what that look means. I've seen it before." She pressed her palm flat against the top rail, not reaching for him, just placing it there. "I'm not going to let anyone take you somewhere worse than here. I don't know yet how I'm going to stop it, but I'm going to." Thunder's nose came forward an inch, then another. Then the warm velvet of his muzzle touched the back of her hand so lightly, she might have imagined it, and stayed there for 3 full seconds, before he pulled back and turned and walked slowly to the center of his corral, and stood in the warm Wyoming dark, like something that was beginning very carefully to consider the possibility of trust. Vera stood at the fence, with her hand still resting on the rail and her eyes burning, and she did not move for a long time because some moments are too fragile to disturb, and some promises are made without words, and she had just made one she intended to keep regardless of what it cost her. She was still standing there when she heard the sound that changed everything, not from the road, not from the bunkhouse, but from inside the corral itself. A sharp, wet crack, then another, then Thunder's scream, but different this time, not fury and not warning, but something rawer and more desperate. And when she looked down, she saw it. Glass. Scattered across the corral floor, catching the moonlight in 100 scattered points, and Thunder was in the middle of it, and he was already bleeding. She was over the fence before she knew she'd decided to move. Not a considered decision. Not courage in any form she would have recognized as such. Just her body responding to something that bypassed thought, entirely the same instinct that had made her cross her father's examination room 100 times, toward animals that were frightened enough to kill her, because the alternative was standing outside and watching something suffer, and she had never once been able to do that. The glass crunched under her boots. She could hear it, feel it shifting beneath her weight, and she was already scanning the ground in the moonlight, already calculating, already moving toward the largest concentrations of it, because the largest pieces were the ones cutting Thunder's hooves deepest, and they were the ones she had to get out of his path first. Thunder screamed and spun toward her. His eyes were white-edged and rolling, his whole body coiled with pain and terror. Every muscle she'd spent 9 days carefully teaching to recognize her now flooded with something older and louder than recognition. "It's me." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to. "Thunder, it's me. I'm here." He reared. Front hooves came up, and she stepped to the side, not running, just repositioning, keeping her movements small and deliberate, because running would trigger something in him that couldn't be untriggered. His hooves came down hard, and he screamed again, and she heard the glass beneath them and felt it in her back teeth. I know it hurts." She was already crouching, already picking up the largest shards with her bare hands, because she had nothing else, because there was no time to go back for gloves, because every second she spent not moving, glass was another second of Thunder walking on it. "Stay with me. Just stay with me." The first cut came immediately, a long piece edge like a razor, and she felt it open her right palm and set it aside and kept working. The pain was information. She filed it and moved on. Behind her she heard running feet, heard Henry's voice calling out, heard Dot's sharper tones cutting across the yard. She didn't turn around. "Miss Hines, get out of there." That was Carl right at the fence. Now his voice controlled, but carrying an edge that said the control was costing him. "Get out now," he's going to. "I need a lantern," she said without turning. "And a broom if there is one. And someone needs to get Mason." Vera. That was Dot, and the use of her real name. Not Miss Hines, not the name she'd arrived under, cut through the noise in a way nothing else could have. "That horse is going to kill you. Not tonight." She moved to another cluster of glass, her hands working mechanically, the pain in her palm spreading up her wrist in steady pulses that she acknowledged and ignored. "Lantern, Dot, please." A silence. Then Dot's voice snapping at someone. "Henry, lantern, now." Thunder was still moving, still panicked his hooves, finding clean ground and glass indiscriminately. And Vera kept working, kept talking to him in that low, continuous voice, Not words so much as sound, the auditory equivalent of a hand held out at a safe distance. Something that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and I am not going to hurt you," in the only language that existed below, fear. He came at her once. Not a full charge more, a lunge, a test pain and panic looking for something to push against. She stood her ground and said his name, just his name, and he stopped 3 feet from her with his sides heaving and his nostrils flaring, and something moving behind his eyes that was not calm but was at least not solely fury. "That's right," she said. "That's right. I'm here." Henry got the lantern over the fence to her without coming in, which was exactly the right instinct, and with the better light, she could see the full scope of it, glass distributed across 2/3 of the corral floor. Too much and too spread to have fallen too deliberately arranged to be anything other than what it was. Someone had thrown this in. Someone had stood at this fence in the dark after the yard went quiet, and done this to him on purpose. She worked for 20 minutes. Her hands were shredded by the end of it. She would not know the full extent until later, would not let herself look until she was outside the fence, because knowing would slow her down, and she could not afford to slow down. She cleared a path. Then the worst concentrations, then swept with her arm along the ground for the smaller pieces she couldn't see clearly. And Thunder moved with her gradually, not calmly, but incrementally, less frantically, following the sound of her voice across the floor of his corral, like a thread pulled through darkness. When she finally straightened and walked to the fence, her legs were shaking. She got over it with less grace than she'd gotten in. Henry caught her arm on the other side, and she let him just for the 3 seconds it took to get her feet under her. Carl was there. His face in the lantern light was hard to read, something moving through it that wasn't quite any single thing. "Your hands," he said. "I know. We need to—" "Where's Mason?" "Riding in now." Someone rode out to the north pasture when the hoofbeats came, then fast and direct, and Mason was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he crossed the yard to the corral fence in 8 strides and looked at Thunder still moving, still bleeding his hooves, leaving dark prints in the dirt. And then he looked at Vera at her hands, and something happened in his face that he immediately locked back down. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question. "I don't know. The glass wasn't there an hour ago. I was just here an hour ago." Vera looked at Carl as she said it, not as an accusation, just as information, just as the fact that it was. Carl met her eyes steadily. "I was in the bunkhouse all evening. Ask any of the men." "I'm not asking you," Vera said. "I'm telling you what I know." Mason stepped to the fence and looked at his horse for a long moment. Thunder had moved to the far end of the corral and stood there trembling, his head low, his sides still heaving. In the lantern light, the blood on his hooves was very dark against the pale dust. "We need the doctor," Mason said quietly. "In the morning," Vera said. "Tonight we need to keep him from walking on it further, and we need to try to clean what we can reach. If you have clean rags and carbolic solution." "I know where the medical supplies are," Dot said from behind her, already turning back toward the house. Mason looked at Vera's hands for the second time. The cuts were visible now in the lantern light, one of them still seeping steadily. "You went in there bare-handed. There wasn't time to go back for anything. You went in there alone." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have words for, not anger, though there was something heated in it. Not gratitude, though, that was somewhere underneath. Something more complicated than either the look of a man who has had the experience of watching someone do the thing he would have done himself if he'd been there in time and doesn't quite know what to do with the feeling that creates. "Dot'll see to your hands," he said finally. "Go inside. I want to help with Thunder." Vera. The use of her name, her real name, which she had never given him, which meant either Dot had used it in his hearing, or he had known something he hadn't let on, stopped her completely. He said it once, not loudly, with the same quiet authority he used for everything. "Let me take it from here tonight." She looked at him. He looked back, those gray eyes, entirely direct and entirely unreadable, and she understood that this was not dismissal. This was a man asking for his portion of the work, the piece that was his to do, and she had done hers, and now it was time to let him do his. She nodded and went inside. Dot cleaned her hands at the kitchen table with carbolic acid and the particular brand of ruthless gentleness that Vera had come to understand was her highest expression of care. It hurt considerably. Vera kept her breathing level. 7 cuts, Dot said, working with methodical precision. 2 of them need to stay wrapped for at least a week. You're going to have scars on this hand. She tied off the last bandage and looked up. Worth it? Yes. Dot put away the medical tin. Carl was in the bunkhouse. I know. He was. I can vouch for it. I brought coffee to the bunkhouse at 9 o'clock, and he was there playing cards with Colt and 2 of the younger hands. Vera absorbed that. Then it was someone else. Or someone he sent. Dot said it without heat, just laying it alongside everything else. Or someone with no connection to Carl at all. There are other people in this valley who'd rather see that horse gone than here. She paused. Grove was here today. Yes. And he left before dark. He left before dark that we saw, Vera said quietly. Dot looked at her for a moment. You think like a careful woman. I've had reason to. Dot stood up, moved to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and set one in front of Vera. She sat down across from her in the way she had of sitting, not tentatively, not heavily, just solidly, as if she had every right to be exactly where she was. I'm going to tell you something, Dot said. Carl Whitten is a good man in the way that a lot of men are good honestly and genuinely, right up until the point where something he wants conflicts with something that's right. Then he gets complicated. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He tried hard with that horse, harder than anyone outside of Mason, and when Thunder put him through the fence the second time, I think something in him decided that his failure was Thunder's fault rather than his own, and that's a story that's comfortable and wrong, and he's been living inside it for 6 months. She looked at Vera steadily. I'm not saying he threw that glass. I'm saying that when something benefits from being believed true, you have to ask who benefits. Who else benefits from Thunder being too dangerous to keep? Grove wants him back. That's clear. Dot sipped her coffee. But Grove being responsible means someone on this property let him in after dark, or someone on this property did it for him. And either of those things means Mason has a problem he doesn't know the full shape of yet. Vera stared at her bandaged hands on the table. The pain had settled into a steady, insistent throb that she had decided to simply coexist with. Does Mason trust Carl? Completely. 11 years. Dot's voice was not without sympathy. Which is why if Carl is involved in this in any way, it's going to break something in Mason that was already cracked. The kitchen was quiet around them. Through the window, the July night was full of stars, the same enormous Wyoming sky she had looked at on her first night here, and felt something close to peace looking at. She looked at it now and felt the weight of all the things she was carrying. Mabel's name, her own history, the lie she got up and maintained every morning, and now this new thing, this threat that had come in from the dark and hurt an animal that was only beginning to learn that not everything hurt. I need to tell you something, Vera said. Dot looked at her over her coffee cup, waited. My name isn't Mabel Hines. The kitchen stayed quiet. Dot's expression didn't shift dramatically. She set her cup down slowly and looked at Vera with eyes that said, among other things, that she was not entirely surprised. Mabel died in Cheyenne before she could get on the train, Vera said. Heat sickness. I met her 3 days before. She showed me the advertisement, told me about the ranch. When she died, I took her ticket, her letter, her name. She kept her voice level because she had said this thing now and she was going to say it all the way. My real name is Vera Holloway. I was running from a marriage that was going to kill me if I stayed in it. I had no money and nowhere to go, and when I saw the ticket in her hand, I made a choice I am not proud of and cannot undo. The silence held for a moment. Then Dot said, "And what exactly do you want me to do with that information?" Vera looked at her. "I don't want you to do anything with it. I couldn't keep sitting here at your table and letting you be kind to me without you knowing who you were being kind to." Dot was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was too complex to name the kind of expression that belongs to women who have lived long enough to know that the distance between the choices people are proud of and the choices they make when they're desperate is shorter than anyone admits. "Vera Holloway," Dot said, finally trying the name, weighing it. "Yes, ma'am." "You ran from a husband?" "Yes." "And you're sitting in someone else's name doing genuinely good work and making real progress with an animal that has defeated every man on this property." Dot picked up her coffee cup again. "I'm not going to tell you what you did was right because it wasn't. I'm not going to tell you the deception doesn't matter because it does." She looked at Vera steadily. "What I'm going to tell you is that you're here now, and what you do from here is what you actually are. And from what I've seen of you in 9 days, you have more of the right kind of character than half the people on this ranch." She sipped her coffee. "Mason will need to know eventually." "I know. Not tonight." "No, not tonight. But before this thing with Grove comes to a head, before whatever is coming comes." Dot set her cup down with finality. "He'll take it better from you than from anyone else, and he'll take it worse from anyone else than from you." Vera nodded. The bandages on her hands were already showing a faint, dark stain at the deepest cut. She pressed them together carefully and held them. "Go to sleep," Dot said. "The horse is with Mason tonight, and Mason won't leave him. In the morning, you'll see what's survivable." What was survivable, as it turned out, was more than Vera had allowed herself to hope for. Thunder's hooves were badly cut, but not to the bone. The doctor from Clearwater, a compact gray-haired man named Aldrich, who smelled of tobacco and took no nonsense from anyone, examined them in the morning with Vera beside him, serving the same function she had served 9 nights ago at the fence: a steady presence, a familiar voice, something that allowed Thunder to hold still while the unfamiliar hands did their work. "He'll heal," Aldrich said, rewrapping the worst hoof with practiced efficiency. "Keep him quiet. No running, no excitement. 2 weeks at minimum." "And her hands," Mason said from outside the fence. Aldrich glanced at Vera's bandaging. "Whoever wrapped these knew what they were doing. Keep them clean. The deep one on the right palm shall have a scar." "She already said that was fine." Dot called from the fence rail, which was the most Dot-like thing that had ever been said, and Vera almost smiled. After Aldrich left, after the yard had settled back to its morning rhythm, Mason came and stood beside Vera, outside Thunder's corral. The stallion was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Not the coiled stillness of something waiting to explode, but something more like exhaustion, the particular vulnerability of a creature that has been frightened past the point of defense and is now simply tired. "He let Aldrich touch him," Mason said. "He let Aldrich touch him because I was there," Vera said. "Same reason he let you near him the other night." Mason looked at her sideways. "What do you mean?" "You went in after I'd already been there for an hour. He recognized that I trusted you enough to stand beside you. That meant something to him." She watched Thunder across the fence. "He reads us, all of us. He's been reading people for a long time because it was the only way he knew to stay alive." Mason was quiet. The July morning was already hot, the sun up and working hard, a faint shimmer over the far pasture where the grass was brown and dry. "Grove will come back," Mason said finally. "I know. He didn't come out here in person just to make an offer. Men like that don't travel for rejections." He kept his eyes on Thunder. "He came to look at something, to see what he was dealing with." "And what do you think he decided he was dealing with?" Mason's jaw tightened slightly. "Something worth more than he paid for it." He paused. "And someone he didn't account for." Vera looked at him. He was looking at Thunder, his profile set and unreadable in the morning light, and she understood that the someone he didn't account for in that sentence was doing a complicated amount of work, and she was not going to make him explain it. "He'll come with something different next time," she said. "Not an offer. Something with more teeth." "Probably." "Then we need to be ready." Mason turned to look at her, then fully directly with those storm-gray eyes that gave nothing easy and took everything in. Her bandaged hands, her steady posture, the fact of her being there in the July morning heat outside a corral where an injured horse stood quietly for the first time in 8 months. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not the surface question, not "why did you go in last night?" or "why do you come here every morning?" The real one, the one underneath all of those. Vera held his gaze. "Because he deserves someone who doesn't quit when it gets hard." Mason looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that he was not going to name, and she was not going to push. "So do most things worth having," he said quietly, and turned back to the fence. And neither of them said anything else, because some understandings don't need finishing. And in the silence between them, in the hot July morning, with the injured horse standing quietly on the other side of the fence, something shifted, not dramatically, not with declaration, but in the way that real things shift slowly, and permanently, and without asking permission. Thunder healed slowly the way things heal when they've been hurt before, and the body has learned to be cautious about believing the worst is over. Vera watched it happen across the 2 weeks that followed the glass incident. The gradual return of weight to the injured hooves, the loosening of that constant vigilance in his posture, the way his ears began to track her arrival each morning, not with alarm, but with something that had no name in any language she knew, except the one her father had taught her, which was simply recognition. The knowledge of a specific person, the beginning of the distinction between this one and all the others. She worked with him every morning and every evening, and in between, she managed the Rocking D's accounts with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that competence was the most durable form of self-protection. The supplier debts were cleared within 10 days. She restructured the payroll recording system so that Mason could read it without her beside him. She cross-referenced the veterinary expenses against the ranch's overall operating costs and presented him with a single page of numbers that told the true financial story of the past year, including what Thunder had cost and what that cost looked like against the ranch's overall position, because she had decided early that Mason Dyer needed honest information more than he needed comfortable information, and that giving him the former was a form of respect. He read it at the supper table one evening without speaking, turned it over, read the back where she'd written her notes in her careful hand, and then set it down and looked at her. "You're telling me we're solid," he said. "I'm telling you you're solid if nothing unexpected happens in the next 6 months. You're vulnerable if it does." "What kind of unexpected?" "The kind Silas Grove might engineer." He held her gaze. "You think he's going to come at this legally?" "I think a man who brings prepared documents to a conversation he presents as spontaneous has already talked to his lawyers, yes." Mason pushed back from the table slightly, not away from the conversation, just giving himself room to think in. Carl was at the other end of the table, ostensibly focused on his own food, and Vera was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, with that careful peripheral attention she'd developed over 4 years of living with a man who required monitoring. Carl had been nothing but professional since the night of the glass. Helpful, competent, present. He had organized the hands to do additional night checks on all the corrals. He had spoken to Mason about reinforcing Thunder's fence, had sourced the lumber himself, had overseen the work personally. If he was performing innocence, it was a performance of considerable quality. If he was genuinely innocent, he was handling the implicit suspicion with more grace than most men would. She still didn't know which it was. She kept watching. "I've been thinking about what Grove wants," Mason said, lowering his voice slightly, including her in a conversation he was having mostly with himself. He didn't sell Thunder because he couldn't handle him. Grove's been breaking horses for 20 years. He knows what he's doing. So why sell him? Because Thunder wasn't broken. Mason said it flatly, like something he'd arrived at after a long journey. Grove's whole operation runs on horses that are submitted, horses that look powerful, but will do what they're told because everything else has been beaten out of them. Thunder never submitted, not fully. He took the damage, but he didn't give Grove what Grove wanted. Which was what? Total compliance. The kind you can sell to a man who wants to feel like he owns something magnificent without having to actually earn it. His jaw tightened. Thunder's worth 10 times what Grove sold him for if he can actually be ridden. If someone can demonstrate that this horse responds to something other than force. That's what Grove came to see when he rode out here. He saw you at the fence. He saw the horse approach you. He paused. He's going to want him back before that becomes a public fact. The table had gone quiet around them. Henry was listening with the transparent attention of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise it. Dot moved between the kitchen doorway and the table with her usual efficiency, but Vera could see from the set of her shoulders that she was hearing every word. Carl said without looking up from his plate. He'd need legal grounds. He'll manufacture them, Mason said. On what basis? Breach of warranty. Misrepresentation of the animal's condition at time of sale. Mason looked at Carl steadily. Or he'll claim the horse constitutes a public safety risk and petition the territorial magistrate for a removal order. Carl looked up then. He can do that. His lawyers can argue for it. Whether a magistrate grants it depends on what evidence exists. Mason's eyes moved briefly to Vera and back. Evidence like 42 failed riders and a corral full of broken glass. The silence that followed had weight in it. Henry said quietly, and with the earnest directness that Vera had come to rely on as a kind of moral weather vane for the room. But things are different now, Miss. He caught himself the slight hesitation, telling her he'd heard Dot use her real name at least once, and hadn't known what to do with the discrepancy. The horse is different now. Anybody can see that. Anybody who's been watching, Vera said. A magistrate who reads a petition written by Grove's lawyers won't have been watching. Then we need someone who has been watching to say so. Henry said, with the simple, logical confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned that the right answer and the available answer are not always the same thing. Mason looked at him for a moment with something close to affection in his expression, the kind a man develops for someone young enough to still believe that truth clearly stated ought to be sufficient. We do, he said, and we need more than testimony. We need demonstration. He looked back at Vera. How close are you? She knew what he was asking. She'd known this question was coming for days the way you know weather is coming, not the exact moment, just the certainty of the direction. 2 weeks ago he let me touch his face, she said. Last week he let me run my hands down his neck and across his withers without flinching. 3 days ago, I had the saddle pad on his back for 4 minutes. She folded her bandaged hands on the table. He's not ready to be ridden. How long? I don't know. It depends on him, not on me. That's the whole point. Grove's not going to wait on Thunder's timeline, Carl said. His voice was measured reasonable, the voice of a man presenting operational reality. If he's going to move legally, he moves in the next month, before any demonstration you could give is persuasive enough to counter it. I know that, Vera said. Then what do you suggest? She looked at Carl. He looked back, and for a moment, the professional reasonableness in his face wavered very slightly, something shifting underneath it that she couldn't read clearly enough to name before it was gone again. I suggest, she said carefully, that we find out exactly what Grove is planning before we decide how to counter it, and that in the meantime, I keep doing what I've been doing. And if the magistrate moves before Thunder is ready, then we deal with that when it happens. Carl nodded slowly, accepting this with a grace that could have been genuine or could have been patience, and Vera could not tell which, and that inability to tell was the thing that kept her awake that night more than anything else. She was at the corral at 4 a.m. because sleep had not been available, and presents had. The July night was warm and close, the stars obscured by a layer of high cloud that had drifted in from the west, and the darkness was softer, more complete than usual. She could hear Thunder before she reached the fence. Not his panicked sounds, not the creak and thud of him testing the rails, just the slow movement of a large animal in a contained space. The occasional breath, the shift of weight. She sat down in her place. Thunder came to the fence within 2 minutes. She'd stopped counting the days it had taken for that to happen, stopped measuring it against any external timeline, because the measuring was a form of impatience, and impatience was the one thing she could not afford with him. He came to the fence and put his nose over the top rail and breathed against her hair, and she sat there and let him and said nothing for a long time. "I have to tell him," she said eventually. Thunder's breath was warm and slow. "I know I have to tell him. I've known since the first week." She pressed her palms flat on her knees, feeling the fading ache in the cuts. "I keep waiting for the right moment, and there is no right moment for this kind of thing. There's just the moment before you do it, and the moment after." She heard footsteps on the dry ground behind her, and didn't startle because she had become accustomed to Mason's particular footfall, the measured, unhurried weight of it, in a way that told her something about the distance she'd traveled from the woman who had flinched at every unexpected sound for 4 years. He sat down beside her, not at a careful social distance, beside her in the way that had become natural between them over these weeks, without either of them naming the process by which it had happened. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No." Thunder was watching Mason with the alert but uncombative attention he now extended to the 3 people whose presence he had decided to tolerate Vera at a distance, and Mason himself grudgingly, incrementally, as though each visit was a negotiation he was willing to engage in, but reserved the right to terminate. "He's looking at me differently than he did a month ago," Mason said. "He's deciding about you," Vera said. "He does it slowly." "Smart. Very." The clouds shifted, and a little starlight came through, enough to see by, not enough to illuminate. Mason sat with his forearms on his knees, looking at his horse, and Vera sat beside him, and the Wyoming night moved around them with its particular summer fullness, warm and large, and indifferent to human complications in the way that only very large things can be. "Grove sent a letter today," Mason said. "Arrived on the afternoon post. His lawyers are claiming the original bill of sale contained an implied warranty of trainability. They're arguing Thunder doesn't meet that standard and the sale should be voided." Vera's hands pressed harder against her knees. "Can they make that argument stick?" "Their lawyer is better than mine. Probably." He said it without self-pity, just the flat honesty she'd come to expect from him about everything. "There's a territorial hearing scheduled, 3 weeks from Thursday. The magistrate will hear both sides and decide whether to issue a removal order. 3 weeks. She did the calculation without meaning to. Thunder's hooves were fully healed. He was letting the saddle pad without protest. She had managed twice to lay her weight across his back without being thrown both times briefly, both times while he stood still. A full ride, 5 minutes controlled in front of a magistrate, or whoever needed to see it, was not 3 weeks away. Not for a horse that needed to set his own pace. And yet, "I need to tell you something," she said. Mason turned to look at her. In the low light, his face was shadowed, but she could see the quality of his attention, that complete, undefended focus he brought to things that mattered. She had rehearsed this. She had found the words in the dark of her room a dozen times, arranged them in orders that minimized damage, that explained, without excusing, that gave him the full truth, without making it about her need to confess rather than his right to know. None of those arrangements survived contact with the actual moment. "My name isn't Mabel Hines," she said. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that he was not surprised, that something in him had known or suspected or decided not to ask, and had been waiting for this, the way you wait for a season you know is coming. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "You know. Dot told me, 2 weeks ago." He said it simply, without drama. After the glass. After your hands. Vera felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. And you didn't send you away. He looked back at Thunder. I thought about it, for about 10 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then I thought about what you'd done that night. Went into that corral alone with your bare hands for an animal that's put 42 men in the ground because you couldn't stand outside and watch him suffer. He paused. I decided I wasn't particularly interested in what name you arrived under. You had a right to be angry. I had a right to a lot of things. Didn't mean they were the most important things on offer. He turned to look at her directly then, and his expression in the low starlight was the most unguarded she had ever seen. It's still not easy, still carrying everything he always carried, but open in a way that cost him something real and was offered anyway. Who are you running from? My husband, Leonard Marsh, St. Louis. She kept her voice steady. He was not a violent man in the ways that leave marks the law recognizes. He was violent in the ways that don't. By the time I understood what was happening to me, I had no money, no family left who could help, and a husband with connections to every institution I might have turned to. She looked at her hands. I met Mabel on the platform in Cheyenne. She was kind to me. When she died, I took her ticket and her name because I was out of options and out of time, and I am not proud of it, but I would do it again because the alternative was going back. Mason was quiet for a long time after she finished. Not the silence of someone formulating a response, the silence of someone sitting with something heavy and deciding how to carry it. Marsh, he said finally. Does he know where you are? No. I've been careful. If he finds out, I know. She had thought about this. She had thought about it every day. It's a risk I've been living with. It becomes my risk too now, he said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact, the kind a man makes when he has decided to step into a situation rather than out of it. Vera looked at him. Mason, I'm not asking you to account for it. I'm telling you the shape of things. He held her gaze without flinching. You're here. You've been doing real work. You've built something with that horse that nobody else could have built. Whatever name you came under, those facts don't change. Something moved in his face, something that might have been the closest thing to an unguarded declaration he was capable of. But I need you to be straight with me from here. About everything. Whatever comes next. I will be, she said. I should have been from the start. Yes, you should have. He said it without softening and without cruelty, which was the most honest form of forgiveness she had ever been offered. Now tell me where we actually are with Thunder. No optimism, no worst case, just where we are. She took a breath. He's letting me put weight across his back, not mounted, just leaning across the saddle. He's tolerating the girth being tightened. His instincts are still there, still dangerous, but there's a window of trust now that wasn't there before. A real one. 3 weeks, Mason said. It might not be enough. It might have to be. He looked at Thunder, who was still standing at the fence, watching them both with those dark, considering eyes. Grove's petition isn't just about the horse. His lawyers filed against my title to the eastern grazing rights at the same time. Same document, separate claim. If the magistrate rules in his favor on Thunder, the eastern boundary goes with it. Vera heard the full weight of that settle. The eastern grazing rights were a third of the ranch's summer pasture. Without them, the Rocking D's cattle numbers couldn't be sustained. She had spent enough time with the accounts to know exactly what that meant. He's not coming for Thunder, she said. He's coming for the ranch. Thunder is the fulcrum. If he can prove I've been negligent, that I've kept a dangerous animal, that the glass incident demonstrates I can't maintain safe conditions, that my judgment has been compromised. Mason stopped. Yes, the ranch. Henry's voice came from the direction of the bunkhouse, low and urgent. Mr. Dyer. They both turned. Henry was crossing the yard at a half run, his young face tight with something that was trying to be controlled and wasn't quite succeeding. "What is it?" Mason said. "Carl's gone." Henry stopped in front of them, breathing harder than the short distance warranted, his hat in his hands. "His horse is gone, his gear from the bunkhouse. Colt heard him moving around at midnight but figured he was just up for the outhouse." Henry swallowed. "I checked his bunk at 3. He's been gone at least 2 hours." The three of them stood there in the warm July dark and absorbed this. Then Mason said very quietly, "Get Colt. Check the fence lines. All of them." He looked at Henry steadily. "And Henry, don't speculate with the other men about why. Just tell them Carl had personal business. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Go." Henry went. Mason stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance, and Vera stood beside him, and the thing that Carl Whitten's disappearance confirmed what it meant about the glass, about Grove, about 11 years of loyalty that had curdled into something else entirely, sat between them in the July night, too large and too clear to require words. Thunder made a sound from the corral, low, almost questioning. Vera turned and looked at him. This horse that had been betrayed by the last foreman, by Grove, by the system that was supposed to protect him, and had instead used him as a piece in someone else's game, and she thought about the hearing in 3 weeks, about the magistrate who would hear Grove's lawyers and their careful documented arguments, and about the things she and Mason had in their corner that Grove's lawyers had not accounted for and Carl's departure had not taken away. "I need to ride him," she said. Mason looked at her. Not perfectly, not without risk. She met his eyes directly. "But enough. I need to ride him in front of whoever needs to see it before that hearing happens. I need to show them what he is now, not what he was." Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You understand what you're asking?" "Yes." "He could throw you. He could hurt you seriously." "I know. And you're asking anyway." "I'm telling you," she said quietly, "what has to happen. The rest is up to you and up to him." Mason looked at Thunder for a long time, long enough that the first gray light of dawn had begun to separate the sky from the earth along the eastern ridge. Then he looked at Vera, her steady posture, her bandaged hands, the absolute absence of performance in her face, and he said, "First light tomorrow. We start." And somewhere behind them, in the direction Carl Whitten had ridden in the dark, a horse's hoofbeats had long since faded, and the road to Clearwater Junction lay empty under the first pale suggestion of a Wyoming summer morning, carrying nothing in either direction but the weight of what had already been set in motion and could not now be stopped. The first morning, Mason brought Clover into the yard alongside Thunder's corral. Vera understood without being told that this was how it was going to go, that she would learn the mechanics of staying on a horse that wanted her off before she attempted the horse that hadn't decided yet what he wanted at all. She was not a natural rider. She knew this about herself within the first 10 minutes, which was about 9 minutes after Mason knew it. Her balance was instinctive, but her hands were wrung too tight, compensating with grip for what she hadn't yet learned to do with weight and posture. Mason corrected her without softening it, and without cruelty, the same way he did everything, and by the end of the first morning her thighs were burning, and her back was making its objections known, and she had managed a controlled canter without grabbing the saddle horn more than twice. "Again," Mason said. She went again. They worked every morning from first light until the heat became dangerous, which in July, Wyoming meant they had roughly 3 hours before the sun turned the yard into something that punished effort rather than rewarding it. Vera spent those 3 hours on Clover, learning what a horse feels like under your body when it decides to test you. The sudden sideways step, the head toss, the collected energy that precedes a decision to be difficult. Clover was not difficult by nature. She was patient and well-mannered and 15 years old, and she tolerated Vera's education with the benevolent resignation of a teacher who has seen worse students and knows they improve eventually. In the afternoons, Vera worked with Thunder. The progression was not linear, which she had expected, because nothing that matters ever is. There were days when he came to her, immediately stood calm while she moved around him, accepted the saddle and the girth, with only a small flinch at the tightening, let her put her weight across his back and breathe there for 5 minutes without his muscles coiling toward explosion. And there were days when a sound from the road, a shift in the wind, the particular quality of light that reminded some deep part of him of a specific bad memory she would never have access to, sent him back behind the wall. Ears, flat eyes, hard. The 10 days of progress feeling suddenly like an illusion. On those days she sat at the fence and did not push. She had learned that the days you sit and do nothing are not wasted days. They are the days you prove that your presence is not conditional on his cooperation, which is the only proof that actually matters to a creature that has been abandoned by everyone who found him inconvenient. Henry watched the process with the open fascination of someone witnessing something he was trying to understand well enough to replicate. He asked good questions. He made himself useful without being asked, appearing with water during the hot part of the day, taking Clover back to the barn when the morning sessions ended, saying nothing when nothing needed to be said. Vera had begun showing him deliberately the specific quality of stillness required, the way you read the ears, the difference between tension that is processing and tension that is about to become action. "You're teaching him," Dot observed one evening watching Henry at the fence from the kitchen doorway. "He has the instinct for it," Vera said. "The instinct is the hard part. Everything else can be learned." "Mason sees it too," Dot said. "Don't think he doesn't." On the 9th day, Vera mounted Thunder fully for the first time. She did not plan it as a milestone. She was simply at the point in the progression where the next thing was to put her leg over, and so she did slowly, with her weight balanced and her hands light, and that low, continuous sound moving from her throat that was not quite humming and not quite talking, but was the sound she made when she needed something frightened to know she was not going away. Thunder's body went rigid beneath her. Every muscle locked. She could feel him gathering himself, could feel the exact quality of the decision being made in his large and complicated mind. And she sat absolutely still and kept making that sound and waited. He did not throw her. He stood there for 45 seconds with her on his back, shaking with the effort of choosing trust over history, and then he took one step forward, and another. And Vera moved with him, and the shake began to ease, and they made half a circuit of the corral at a walk that was the most imperfect and important thing she had done in her life. Mason was at the fence. She didn't look at him because looking away from Thunder was not something she was going to do in the first 60 seconds of the first ride, but she heard the quality of his silence change, heard something release in him that had been held for a very long time. When she dismounted, her legs barely held her. Mason came into the corral. He stood beside Thunder and placed one hand on the stallion's neck, and Thunder shifted away slightly, but did not spin or strike, and Mason stood very still, with his hand resting there, and his jaw set against whatever was moving through his face, and Vera watched the two of them. This man and this horse both damaged in ways that didn't show cleanly from the outside, both standing in the same July dust, learning something that should have been simple and had turned out to be the hardest thing either of them had ever done. 11 days, Mason said finally. "Until the hearing," she said. "Yes. We'll be ready." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was not doubt. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has been told something he wants very badly to be true, and is trying to decide if he's allowed to believe it. "We'll be ready," she said again, and meant it differently the second time, and he heard both meanings and nodded. The morning of the territorial hearing arrived on the back of a summer thunderstorm that had rolled through Powder River Valley the night before, and left the air washed clean, and the ground smelling of wet sage, and the kind of clarity that only exists in the hours after a storm has said everything it needed to say. The sky was the hard, bright blue of a Wyoming summer morning. The heat was already building. They arrived in Clearwater Junction with the hearing set for 10 o'clock. The magistrate's office was in the building beside the land records office on the main street. a practical, unadorned room with a long table chairs along two walls and windows that looked out over the dust of Main Street, where a small crowd had gathered because word travels fast in small territories, and a dispute over a horse and a land boundary between Mason Dyer and Silas Grove's lawyers was exactly the kind of story that draws people on a Thursday morning in July. Grove was already there when they arrived. He stood at one end of the long table with two men in suits who had the particular bearing of lawyers, the way they occupied space, as if they were already constructing an argument about it. Grove himself looked precisely as he had on the ranch-polished pleasant the expression of a man who has already won and is being gracious about it in advance. He looked at Vera, and something flickered in his eyes. She met it without looking away. The magistrate was a woman named Helen Garrett, which Vera had not known to expect, and which shifted something in the room the moment she entered, a woman in her 50s, compact and unhurried with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the expression of someone who has spent a long career sorting through what people claim from what is actually true. She sat. She opened the file. She said, "Mr. Grove's counsel will present first." And the lawyer on the left began to speak. The legal argument was thorough and carefully built. Vera listened to it the way she had listened to Leonard's justifications for years, tracking not just the words, but the architecture, the places where the structure depended on assumptions that sounded like facts, the moments where confident phrasing was doing the work that evidence should have done. The lawyer cited the failed rides, the injuries to ranch hands, the glass incident, as evidence of inadequate safety management. He cited a veterinary report Grove had commissioned, which described Thunder as constitutionally unsuitable for domestication. He cited the implied warranty clause with the smoothness of a man who had prepared this argument at considerable expense. When he finished, Magistrate Garrett looked at Mason and said, "Response." Mason stood. He was not a man who used more words than necessary, and he did not use more now. He stated the timeline, the purchase, the 8 months of work, the injuries that had occurred when methods of force were used on an animal that had been conditioned by previous abuse to respond to force with violence. He described the change in Thunder's behavior over the past month. He was specific, and he was brief, and he was completely credible, and Vera watched the magistrate's face as he spoke, and saw her listening in the way that meant she was actually hearing. Then Mason said, "I'd like to request a demonstration." Grove's lawyer said, "Objection." "This is not a courtroom," Magistrate Garrett said pleasantly. "There are no objections. Mr. Dyer, what kind of demonstration?" "The petition claims Thunder is unrideable and constitutes a public danger. I'd like to demonstrate that neither of those things is currently true." Grove said from across the table, "The horse put 42 men in the hospital." 42 men who used methods he'd been specifically traumatized to respond to with violence, Vera said. She had not been invited to speak. She spoke anyway with the calm that had taken her 4 years of a different kind of danger to develop. "I've been working with him for 5 weeks using a different approach. I can demonstrate the difference." The room was very quiet. Magistrate Garrett looked at her over the reading glasses. "And you are?" "Vera Holloway. I manage the Rocking D household and accounts. I've also been working directly with the horse since my arrival." "You're the mail-order bride," Grove said, and the way he said it carried an edge of dismissal that was precisely calibrated to be deniable as rudeness. "I'm the woman who cleared broken glass out of that horse's corral with her bare hands at midnight when someone threw it in to hurt him," Vera said, and she kept her voice level and let the words do the work, and across the table she saw one of Grove's lawyers make a small note and knew what note he was making. "I'm also the woman who can ride him, which I'd like to do now if Magistrate Garrett is willing to observe." Helen Garrett looked at Vera for a moment with an expression that contained considerably more than its surface. Then she said, "I am." They moved outside. The crowd on Main Street had grown. Word moved through Clearwater Junction faster than horses, and Vera was aware of the faces lining the fence of the stock pen beside the land office, where Henry had already positioned Thunder saddled, waiting, his dark coat gleaming in the July sun. He saw her immediately. Even across the distance, even in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by more people and more noise than he had experienced since Grove's operation in Denver, his ears came forward. Just that. Just the specific recognition of one person in a crowd of strangers. Vera walked to him without hurrying. She could feel every eye in the street on her back, and she set that information aside in the place where she kept things that were true but not currently useful. What was useful right now was the horse in front of her and the sound she was already making in her throat before she was close enough for it to matter, that low, continuous hum that was not music and not speech, but was the sound of one creature saying to another, "I am here. I have always come back. I am here." Thunder pushed his nose against her shoulder. She heard the crowd react to that, a low murmur the quality of surprise, and she didn't acknowledge it. She ran her hand up his neck and felt him steady under her palm and said, "Good morning, handsome. We have to do something important today. I need you with me." His ears tracked her voice. She checked the girth, adjusted the stirrup length, put her foot in, and pulled herself up in one smooth motion, and Thunder shifted his weight once, just once, and then stood. She walked him to the center of the stock pen. She could see Magistrate Garrett at the fence beside Mason, whose face was stone, whose hands were absolutely still at his sides. She could see Grove on the other side with his lawyers, his expression carefully neutral. She could see Henry at the gate with his hat in his hands and his young face bright with something he wasn't bothering to contain. She could see Dot at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, watching with the focused attention of a woman who has invested something real in the outcome. She asked Thunder to walk, and he walked. She asked him to trot, and he trotted a little uncertain, a little tight in the hindquarters, but willing, genuinely willing, which was the thing that none of Grove's documentation could account for or manufacture. She brought him back to a walk and turned him in a figure eight, and he followed her hands with the careful attention of a creature that has decided fully and without reservation that this one specific person is worth trusting. 4 minutes. At 4 minutes, she heard a sound from the far side of the fence, sharp, deliberate, the crack of leather against wood. A strap. The same sound that had been used the night of the glass to send Thunder into a panic in his own corral, the sound that was threaded through his worst memories, like wire through a wound. Thunder's head shot up. His body went rigid beneath her. She felt the exact moment he left the present and entered the past, felt it in the explosive tightening of every muscle, the way his weight shifted back onto his haunches, the breath that came in one sharp pull and held. The crowd flinched back from the fence. Vera dropped the reins. She brought both hands up slowly, palms open, and she began to sing. Not hum. Not the low private sound of the corral at 4 in the morning. She sang full voice out loud in front of everyone in Clearwater Junction on a Thursday morning in July, the song her mother had taught her when she was small enough that her mother's arms around her had been the whole definition of safety. A simple melody, the kind that doesn't require skill to carry, just the willingness to make it. Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound. She kept singing, kept her hands open, kept her weight perfectly still and perfectly balanced, and she watched him come back from wherever that sound had sent him, not quickly, not easily, but come back the way someone comes back from a very bad place, when they hear something familiar enough to be worth returning for. His head lowered. His back softened under her. The held breath released in one long shudder that she could feel through the saddle. "That's it," she said inside the song, inside the melody, weaving the words through it. "That's right. Just me. Just us. You're all right." 5 minutes. The bell. Someone had agreed to ring when 5 minutes was reached, rang out over the stock pen, and over Main Street, and over the crowd that had gone so quiet she could hear the July wind in the single cottonwood at the edge of town. And Vera brought Thunder to a halt in the center of the pen, and sat there on his back in the summer morning, with her hands resting open on her thighs, and her heart going so hard she could feel it in her ears. She dismounted. Thunder pressed his face against her shoulder and stood there breathing. Magistrate Garrett's voice carried across the pen with the composed authority of a woman who has seen enough to be untheatrical about her own competence. "Who made that sound?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Henry said from the gate, clear and young and absolutely certain, "It came from behind the far fence post. Man in a gray coat. I saw him do it." The crowd shifted. Two men near the post moved aside, and there was Carl Whitten, not looking at Mason, not looking at anyone. His face carrying the expression of a man who made a calculation and now has to live with the result of it. Beside him stood one of Grove's men. The strap was still in his hand. Magistrate Garrett said, "Someone get the marshal." Grove said, "I have no knowledge of Mr. Grove." Magistrate Garrett turned to look at him, and the quality of her attention over those reading glasses was the kind that does not require a raised voice to constitute a verdict. "You will have the opportunity to say whatever you'd like to say to the marshal. Right now, I would appreciate your silence." Grove closed his mouth. Mason walked through the gate of the stock pen and crossed the distance to Vera without hurrying, and stood in front of her in the July morning with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes doing everything his voice had not yet found words for. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." "He could have thrown you." "He didn't." "He almost isn't what happened." She looked at him steadily. "What happened is he heard me, and he came back." Mason held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "So did I. When I needed to." The marshal arrived. Carl Whitten and Grove's man were taken into custody on charges of interference and conspiracy that would, as it turned out, take 3 months to fully prosecute, but would result in sentences and fines, and in Grove's case, a separate investigation into his operations in Denver that had been accumulating complaints for years and had only needed a specific documented incident in front of a territorial magistrate to become a case that could actually be made. Magistrate Garrett's ruling came that afternoon. She dismissed Grove's petition in full. She upheld Mason's title to the Eastern grazing rights. She noted in the written record that the demonstration had provided sufficient evidence to establish that the horse's previous behavior was the direct result of conditioning through abuse rather than inherent temperament, and that the current management of the animal reflected competent and humane practice. She said this in legal language that was precise and cool, and constituted in its way the most complete exoneration possible of everything Vera had spent 5 weeks trying to prove. Carl Whitten confessed to throwing the glass. He had been in Grove's employ for 7 months since the previous winter, when Grove had approached him in Clearwater with money and a plan, and the precise appeal to a man whose bitterness had been looking for a direction. He had not thrown the glass to kill the horse, he said. He had thrown it to accelerate a process he believed was inevitable. It was the kind of distinction that people make when they need to believe they are not as bad as what they did, and it was not a distinction the law found particularly meaningful. Mason did not speak about Carl after the confession. He went quiet in the specific way he went quiet when something had cost him more than he was going to let show, and Vera did not push at it, because she understood by now that some griefs require space rather than company, and that one of the things she could offer him that nobody else had was the knowledge of when to be present and when to be silent. She offered him both in their appropriate seasons, and he received both without asking for explanations, because that too was something they had built between them, the capacity to communicate in the register below words, which is the register where the real things live. In September, when the summer heat had finally broken and the first cool air was coming down from the bighorns in the mornings, Vera stood at Thunder's corral at sunrise and watched him graze in the early light. Not in the isolated pen in the main pasture now, alongside the working horses, the fence between him and the rest of the herd down, because it turned out that what he'd needed all along was not careful separation, but the permission to simply be among other creatures without being required to prove anything. He still startled at sharp sounds. He probably always would. Some things leave permanent marks, and that is simply the truth of certain kinds of damage, and you build a life that accounts for it rather than pretending it isn't there. Mason came to stand beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one without comment, because by September, this was simply what mornings looked like. "Letter from the territorial office," he said. "Grove's Denver operation has been shut down. 16 horses seized and transferred to sanctuaries." Vera wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt something release in her chest. "Good. There's more." He paused, and she could hear in the pause that this was something he'd been carrying for a while and had now decided to put down. "Aldrich stopped by yesterday while you were in town. He's been talking to ranchers across the valley about what happened here, about the methods." He looked at Thunder in the pasture. "He wants to know if you'd be willing to work with him on a formal program, teaching other ranchers, other horses." Vera looked at him. "A formal program?" His word. "He has the Territorial Agricultural Board interested, wants to present in Cheyenne in the spring." Mason turned to look at her directly. "He asked if I thought you'd consider it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought you'd do whatever you decided was right, and I wasn't in the habit of deciding that for you." The corner of his mouth moved in what she had learned over these months to read as the full extent of his smiling. "I also told him that if he wanted to make use of the Rocking D as a demonstration site, he was welcome, and that the woman who built this thing would need to be compensated appropriately and credited by name." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "By my name," she said. "By your name. Vera Holloway." He held her gaze. "Your name, your work, your methods." He paused. "I filed the amended household registry with the county clerk last week. I should have done it sooner." She felt the full weight of what he'd done land in her chest. Not the legal mechanics of it, but what it meant, what it said about the kind of man he was, and the kind of partnership he was offering her, built on her actual name, and her actual work, and the actual truth of who she was, and what she had done here. "Mason," she said. "I know it's not a conventional," he started. "Ask me," she said. He stopped. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that had been reading her correctly since the moment she stepped off the Cheyenne train and walked toward him on the platform, and he said, "Stay, not as an arrangement, not as a contract, as a partner in all of it. The ranch, the work, whatever that program in Cheyenne turns into, whatever comes after that." He held her gaze without deflection, without the stone face he used when he was protecting himself from something. "Stay as yourself." "Yes," she said. Just that. The same word she had given him at the fence in the dark all those weeks ago, but weighted differently now, weighted with everything that had happened between that moment and this one. All the broken glass and healed hooves and honest confessions and July mornings sitting in the dust outside a corral. All of it compressed into a single syllable that meant everything she had not been able to say in 4 years of living someone else's life. Thunder lifted his head from the pasture grass and looked at them both across the morning with those dark, clear eyes that had learned slowly and permanently, and against considerable evidence to the contrary, that this place was safe and these people were worth trusting. And in the end, that was the whole story. Not the 42 men who failed, not the broken glass, not the lawyers and the magistrate and the verdict. The whole story was this: a woman who had been running long enough to forget that some things were worth stopping for, and a man who had been closed long enough to forget that some things were worth opening to, and a horse that had been hurt enough to forget that trust was possible at all. And what happened when all 3 of them in the same July dust, in the same Wyoming valley, decided to try anyway? They built something that lasted not because it was easy and not because any of them were untouched by the things that had broken them, but because they were stubborn enough and honest enough and brave enough to build it from exactly what they were, scars and all, and that in the end turned out to be more than enough.